February 17th, 1979. China's leaders promised the world a lesson for Vietnam, unleashing nearly 500,000 troops with boasts of a quick, punishing victory. Instead, in just 30 days, the People's Liberation Army lost at least 26,000 men, more than the Soviets lost in a decade of Afghanistan. How did Asia's largest army, fresh off Maoist glory and outnumbering its enemy nearly 6-1, walk straight into a disaster so complete that today neither side dares to speak its name? The answers reveal a forgotten humiliation that would force China to change its entire military, and the story begins with a single fatal miscalculation. Deng Xiaoping's decision to invade Vietnam was driven by a single, unwavering belief. China's army, the People's Liberation Army, could not lose. In Beijing's halls of power, the war was framed as a quick punishment for Vietnam's recent actions in Cambodia, where Vietnamese troops had toppled the Khmer Rouge, China's closest ally in Southeast Asia. Deng called it a lesson, not a campaign, and reassured his American hosts that Vietnam would be swiftly disciplined. The operation was planned as a lightning strike: seize border towns, inflict pain, then withdraw before the world could react. But behind the confident slogans, the People's Liberation Army was still frozen in time. Not a single major battle had tested Chinese troops since 1953, when the Korean War ended. For 26 years, China's army had trained and marched, but never fought. Its leaders clung to the doctrine of Mao Zedong, who declared the People's Liberation Army would sweep enemies away like rivers and seas. Mass mobilization, overwhelming numbers, and the power of the people were the guiding principles. Senior commanders believed that sheer force would crush any resistance, no matter how determined. No one in the Central Military Commission seemed to doubt the plan. Intelligence reports insisted that Vietnam's best divisions were far away, bogged down in Cambodia. The generals promised Deng a victory measured in days, not weeks. The People's Liberation Army would storm across the border, capture key cities like Cao Ba, Lao Cai, and Lang Son, then leave Vietnam's leaders humiliated and the border secure. In the minds of China's senior planners, defeat was not even a possibility. The war would be a demonstration, proof that China's revolutionary army was still the master of Asia. Vietnam's northern border was defended by a force that had spent decades in combat. Around 130,000 troops, regulars, regional units, and local militia were spread across a rugged frontier, where every mountain pass could become a fortress. These defenders were no strangers to war. Many had fought against Japan in the 1940s, then against the French, and most recently against the United States. By 1979, they had mastered the art of fighting a stronger enemy on home ground. The border region itself offered natural protection and deep fortifications. Steep hills, dense forests, and twisting valleys made movement slow and dangerous for any invader. Vietnamese engineers and villagers spent years preparing for the next attack. They carved tunnel networks into hillsides, built bunkers from stone and earth, and planted mines along likely approaches. Every village had its own defense plan. Communication lines ran underground, safe from artillery barrages. The defenders arranged themselves in layers to create real depth. Regular army units held key strongpoints, while local militia and border guards manned outposts and set ambushes along trails. If one position fell, another waited behind it. This depth made it nearly impossible for attackers to break through quickly. Vietnamese troops used the terrain to vanish after a fight, then reappear where least expected. Even artillery fire rarely dislodged them for long. Experience taught them not to waste men in open battles. Instead, they relied on small unit tactics, surprise attacks, and careful use of anti-tank weapons. They knew the land better than any map could show. When Chinese columns advanced, they found themselves slowed by obstacles, harassed by snipers, and cut off from supplies. The Vietnamese defenders had turned the border into a maze of traps, ready to make any invasion a costly ordeal. Chinese commanders entered the war convinced that massed numbers and old-school doctrine would overwhelm any defense. But on the ground, their systems were already failing. The People's Liberation Army relied on radios so outdated that units often lost contact after only a few miles. Orders sent from headquarters arrived late or not at all. In the confusion, regiments advanced without knowing where their neighbors were, or even where the enemy had gone. Artillery and air support, crucial for breaking strongpoints, rarely arrived when needed. The People's Liberation Army had no real doctrine for close air or artillery coordination. Infantry units charged ahead, expecting support that never materialized. Tanks rolled forward without infantry screens, making them easy targets for Vietnamese ambush teams armed with Soviet rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles. On the Vietnamese side, every position was a trap. Defenders used field telephones and buried cables to keep their lines secure, safe from jamming or interception. Small units coordinated with mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank squads, shifting positions as soon as the Chinese found their range. Years of fighting had taught them how to blend guerrilla tactics with Soviet-style combined arms defense. The result was a deadly paradox. China's army, built for mass offensives, was blind and deaf in the mountains. Vietnamese defenders, outnumbered but tightly coordinated, could strike, disappear, and strike again. The gap between doctrine and reality grew wider with every mile. For the People's Liberation Army, every advance meant greater risk, and every step forward was a potential disaster waiting in the fog of war. At dawn on February 17th, a single hill in Vietnam's northern frontier became a proving ground for everything the Chinese command believed about war. On paper, the odds were overwhelming. Nearly 2,800 Chinese troops advanced in waves toward a position held by just 20 Vietnamese defenders. The hill's rocky flanks and narrow approaches had been mapped, mined, and sighted in by machine gunners who knew every inch. For 5 hours, the attacking force surged up the slopes, expecting the defenders to break under sheer weight. Instead, they ran into a storm of coordinated fire from trenches and bunkers dug deep into the hillside. Mortar shells bracketed the approach, and every time the Chinese regrouped, another line of defenders opened up from a new angle. The Vietnamese platoon worked in silence, shifting positions through communication trenches and relaying ammunition by hand. They had no illusions about survival, but every minute counted. The longer the stand, the more chaos they could sow in the enemy's ranks. Chinese commanders relying on mass formation tactics funneled company after company into the same kill zone. The result was carnage. By the time the last shots faded, the attackers had suffered between 360 and 422 casualties, a staggering toll inflicted by a force outnumbered more than 100 to 1. Stories of individual heroism filtered out later, with some survivors promoted for their actions. But the lesson was already written in blood. The hill did not fall until the defenders were nearly all dead or wounded, and even then the Chinese advance had lost its momentum. The myth of numerical inevitability, of victory by sheer size, shattered against a handful of determined soldiers and a well-prepared position. For the People's Liberation Army, the hill became a warning. Every inch of ground in Vietnam would have to be paid for again and again in lives. Lao Cai was supposed to fall in 3 days. That was the order from Beijing: swift capture, minimal resistance, a clean victory for the world to see. Instead, the fight for this border city turned into a 16-day nightmare. Chinese assault columns flooded the outskirts, expecting a quick breakthrough. What they found was a maze of barricaded alleyways, and defenders dug in behind every wall. The streets were choked with debris and water, the river swollen from recent rains, turning every advance into a slog through ankle-deep mud. Vietnamese regulars, militia, and even civilians fought from basements, rooftops, and behind shattered storefronts. Every building became a fortress. As Chinese infantry moved forward, they were met by bursts of automatic fire from hidden positions, then grenades dropped from above. When the People's Liberation Army units tried to regroup, mortar rounds landed with deadly precision. The defenders never stayed in one place for long, slipping through back alleys, moving supplies and messages through tunnels, always one step ahead of the attackers. Chinese commanders pushed their troops forward, convinced that overwhelming numbers would carry the day. But the city devoured men and machines alike. Outdated radios failed in the chaos, leaving battalions isolated and confused. Artillery support arrived late, or not at all. Tanks sent to break the deadlock became targets, blocked by barricades or ambushed in narrow streets. The fighting dragged on, day after day, with no sign of collapse from the defenders. By the time the city finally changed hands, the cost was staggering. Chinese losses reached nearly 8,000, almost 3,000 confirmed dead, with thousands more wounded or missing. The People's Liberation Army had taken Lao Cai, but at a price that shocked even their own officers. What was supposed to be a showcase of Chinese strength had become a warning. Victory on paper, disaster in reality. The lesson was written in blood and ruin. In Vietnam, every inch of ground was paid for many times over. Type 59 tanks, the pride of the People's Liberation Army, rolled into Vietnam with banners flying and crews expecting a rapid advance. Instead, those armored columns became targets. Vietnamese anti-tank teams waited in the hills, armed with Soviet-made RPG launchers and wire-guided missiles. The terrain funneled the armor into narrow valleys and broken roads, turning every kilometer into a potential ambush. In some sectors, entire platoons of tanks vanished in minutes, engines still running, hatches blown open, crews abandoning their vehicles under fire. Estimates of losses range wildly. Official Chinese reports admit to 44 tanks destroyed, while Western analysts put the number as high as 276. What is certain is that armored columns meant to spearhead the invasion ended up as twisted metal, littering the mountain passes. For many tank crews, the inside of a Type 59 became a death trap. No infantry support, no air cover, just the sound of shells slamming into steel. Infantry fared no better. Chinese commanders, locked into the playbook of the Korean War, sent wave after wave of soldiers across open ground. Vietnamese machine gunners cut down entire companies in minutes. The pattern repeated from one strong point to the next, massed assaults, mounting casualties, and confusion as orders failed to reach the front lines. In some attacks, so many bodies piled up in the approach trenches that the next wave stumbled over their own dead. Survivors described the horror of advancing through smoke and screams, only to be mowed down by defenders who seemed to melt away and reappear elsewhere. Lang Son, the final prize, was supposed to redeem the losses. After 3 days of house-to-house fighting, Chinese troops finally raised their flag over what was left of the provincial capital. The victory was hollow. Vietnamese forces had already evacuated, leaving behind scorched earth and booby traps. The PLA planted their banner in a city reduced to rubble, unable to advance any further. Official photographs showed triumph, but the reality was a city emptied by defenders and a campaign that had bled China's army white. The world saw a flag on ruins, not the victory Beijing had promised. Behind the propaganda, the cost was undeniable. Hundreds of tanks lost or abandoned, entire companies erased in a single day, and a so-called victory that left nothing but wreckage and unanswered questions. No one could agree on the true cost of China's war in Vietnam. Beijing's official line claimed just 6,700 soldiers killed and fewer than 15,000 wounded, a figure presented as proof of a controlled, victorious campaign. Hanoi countered with a staggering number: 62,000 Chinese dead and more than 400,000 wounded or missing. Western analysts, sifting through satellite photos, intercepted reports, and hospital records, settled on a middle number, around 26,000 Chinese killed in just 4 weeks. That is more deaths than the Soviets suffered in a decade of fighting in Afghanistan. The gap was not just a matter of accounting. For China, minimizing losses was essential to maintain the image of strength and to hide a disaster from its own people. For Vietnam, inflating enemy casualties served as a warning, deterrence by body count. Western estimates, though more restrained, still painted a picture of a campaign gone badly wrong. No matter which number is closest to the truth, the propaganda war over the dead made one thing certain: the price paid on both sides was far higher than anyone in Beijing dared admit. Vietnam's presence in Cambodia did not end with China's invasion. Despite the scale of the assault and the destruction left behind, Vietnamese troops held their ground in Phnom Penh and across Cambodia for another 10 years, refusing to withdraw until 1989. The war's primary objective, to force a Vietnamese retreat, remained out of reach. Instead, both countries dug in for the long haul. By the early 1980s, more than 600,000 soldiers from each side were stationed along the border, locked in a tense standoff that would last into the next decade. Skirmishes flared up again and again, but the front lines barely moved. The campaign that was supposed to reshape regional power left the map unchanged. Instead of breaking Vietnamese resolve, the invasion convinced Hanoi to fortify every stretch of the northern frontier. For China, the cost was more than lives lost. It was a strategic dead end. The lesson was clear to military planners. Brute force had failed to deliver a political solution, and the threat from Vietnam was now more entrenched than ever. Deng Xiaoping returned from the border war with a bitter realization. The People's Liberation Army, once feared across Asia, was now exposed as a hollow force. The myth of Mao's invincible legions had collapsed in the mud and mountains of northern Vietnam. Within months, Deng ordered a sweeping purge of senior commanders tied to the old ways, men who had survived the Cultural Revolution but could not adapt to modern warfare. The Central Military Commission saw a wave of retirements and dismissals, clearing the path for new leadership open to change. Deng did not stop at personnel. He pushed the military into the heart of his 4 modernizations, demanding that the People's Liberation Army abandon mass mobilization and embrace technology. Procurement shifted from endless stockpiles of rifles and uniforms to radar, communications gear, and advanced artillery. Military academies rewrote their doctrine, scrapping human wave tactics for combined arms and precision strikes. Training camps, once filled with political slogans and marching drills, began to focus on small unit tactics and real-world scenarios. By the late 1980s, the People's Liberation Army was no longer the army that had crossed into Vietnam. Deng's reforms set China on a path toward a professional, tech-driven military. It remained untested in battle, but it had been fundamentally transformed by the lessons of 1979. Today, China commands cutting-edge weapons, but its army has not faced a peer in battle since 1979. As tensions simmer over Taiwan, the real test remains unproven. Can modern technology overcome the lessons of blood and hubris? In military history, forgetting hard-won truths always carries a price. The ghosts of that border war still watch, waiting to see if they will be remembered or repeated.